Good morning and welcome to the first session of the Jewish Learning Center. My name is Rabbi Ron House, and hopefully we will spend the next 10 weeks together studying various subjects in Jewish thought and Jewish life. I am recording today's session on Monday morning, December the 7th, and it was exactly 1 month ago today, on November the 7th, that the Jewish world lost a towering figure, a rabbi, a scholar, a prolific writer by the name of Jonathan Sacks. Today marks the 30th day, the Shaloshim, of Rabbi Sacks's passing, and I have decided to dedicate not merely this lecture or the series of lectures today, but all of the lectures of this first trimester of the Jewish Learning Center to Rabbi Sacks's memory. He was an incredible man, a man who influenced world Jewry. From the beginning of his career, he served communities across the world. Most especially, he served as chief rabbi in Great Britain from the period of 1990s all the way to the period of the mid-215s, for a period of about 22 years. Rabbi Sacks, who was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, also was a peer in the House of Lords. He was a man who in his life influenced many Jewish adults to continue their studies. And it is fitting that the Jewish Learning Center, which is committed to the idea of adult education, should begin its lectures in memory of Sir Jonathan Sacks, a wonderful rabbi and a wonderful scholar. Hopefully, those of you who are seeing me now have done what you were supposed to have done. You have already taken the opportunity to read this week's assigned readings. Let me stress again how important it is for you to do the assigned reading each week. The purpose of this lecture presentation will be to both clarify and amplify some of the material that you have already read. But the real meat of our course, the real substance of our course, will take place in our chat room discussions, which will follow by 1 week each of our presentations. So I am announcing to those of you who are seeing me now, this is the In the Beginning Genesis session, that the first of our chat rooms will begin next Monday evening at 7 o'clock. The chat room discussion is scheduled to last about an hour. It is optional. If you choose not to participate in the chat room, if you have no questions, if you would like to rely just on the readings and the presentation, that's perfectly acceptable. However, if you would like to explore further the themes that we will be discussing each week, I urge you to come into the chat room, even if it's just to listen. Allow me to say a word about today's lecture. Today is week 1, and this week we are starting our study of the book of Genesis with a lesson called In the Beginning. The beginning is always a wonderful place to begin a story. All stories begin in the beginning. Allow me to digress, as I say that, to talk about an experience that some of you may have had. If any of you have ever traveled to Rome, it is quite possible that in your tour of Rome, you had the occasion to visit the Vatican. And if you visited the Vatican, you probably, as one of the stops on your Vatican tour, had an opportunity to see a very famous chapel. It is known as the Sistine Chapel. It is famous for being a center of Catholic life. It is famous also for the beautiful artwork which decorates it. And if you have gone into the chapel and have seen the frescoes which cover the walls and the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel, you will perhaps best remember the 9 paintings that are found on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, these famous paintings that were created by the artist Michelangelo. Now, of all Michelangelo's works, none are perhaps as famous as the frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And of those 9 scenes that depict the works of creation, that depict the story of creation, perhaps the most famous is the creation on the 6th day of mankind, where you see God depicted as reaching out his hand to man, whom he has created as the culmination of his works of creation. This fresco, this magnificent work, was the tribute that was being paid by one of the greatest artists of the 16th century to an artist even greater than he. When Michelangelo painted these frescoes, he was paying tribute to God, the greatest creator, the greatest artist of all time, who fashioned the most enduring of all works, the work of the world and of humanity. And so it is, we begin our story of creation there in the Sistine Chapel. Imagine you are looking up at the ceiling. Imagine you are seeing displayed before you each of the stages of the days of creation. The biblical story of creation is probably one of the best known stories in all of Western history. The story of how in the beginning God created the world in 6 days, and at the end of that period of creation, how he capped off his period of activity by ceasing from work, by resting, and by designating the Sabbath day as a day of contemplation and appreciation, that all humanity and all creation might give praise to its creator. In our course of study this trimester, we will be exploring the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. That's all. The first 11 chapters. It's not a lot of reading, but I would argue that those first 11 chapters are critically important in understanding the nature of the Jewish people, in understanding indeed the nature of humanity and humanity's place in the world. In a sense, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is kind of a background to what mankind's purpose is in the world and what God wants of us. And as we study these chapters, we will look critically at the material that we read, and we will try and understand it in a deeper sense. From the story of the creation to the time of the first Jew, 20 generations later, Abraham, all the way through the stories that continue in the Bible until the end of the biblical period, we see before us God's unfolding plan for his world and for humanity. In order to understand these books, and especially these first 11 chapters of the Torah, I want to briefly go over with you the correct way of understanding what the book of Genesis, what the Torah is really all about. And I'm going to begin by telling you what it's not about, okay? What the Torah is not, so that when you read it, you are not looking for something that is not there. The problem that many people have when they come to study Torah, when they come to study the book of Genesis, is they're trying to read it as the wrong kind of literature. The books of the Torah are not meant to be a scientific work. If you are looking into the Torah for a scientific explanation of the world, you are bound to be disappointed. The Torah was not given by God to sophisticated people who knew all about the sciences. The Torah was given to plain and simple human beings to teach them certain elemental truths of human life. And therefore, as we go through the stories of the Torah, and you say to yourself, well, this can't be right. How can it be that the world is only 5,781 years old? Archaeology tells us that the world is much older than that. The Torah can't be speaking seriously. Well, it's speaking seriously, but it's not speaking scientifically. The Torah was not meant to be a book of how the universe came into existence. It is supposed to be a book that describes why the universe came into existence. There are episodes that you will read that will seem problematic. You will read about the ages of the first 10 generations of human beings, and those ages span hundreds and hundreds of years. And you're going to say to yourself, well, that can't be. Human beings don't live 6, 7, 8, even 900 years. Well, of course they don't. But again, if you understand what the Torah is trying to say, and don't read it literally, and don't read it as a scientific or a biological text, then you begin to understand the true message of the Torah. Some of you will read episodes in our study of Torah, and you will say, that is improbable. It sounds fantastic. It sounds mythic. Did a serpent in the Garden of Eden really talk to Eve and suggest to her that she should taste the fruit in the middle of the Garden of Eden? Do serpents actually talk? Well, of course not. That is not our experience. But that is not what the Bible is trying to say. And hopefully, as we study these chapters, I will teach you a new way of understanding the Bible that resolves all of these contradictions that obviously arise if we regard it as a scientific text. My second observation is that the Torah is also not a history text. History only began to be written seriously about 12 to 1300 years after the time of Abraham. That was the time when history was first written and recorded, and texts that we recognize as historical texts were first produced. I am not telling you that the events of the Torah did not take place. I believe that they did. But they did not take place in a historical sense. In other words, in a sense that I can say on such and such a date at such and such a time, this event or that event happened. I believe the Torah is true. I believe the process that it describes is true, but it is not a historical document. And so if you look for historical comparisons or comparisons with other civilizations, you will not find those comparisons in the Torah. The Torah is concerned with one subject only: God's relationship with humanity, and especially how that relationship took form and received its purpose in God's relation to one particular people, the people of Israel. Therefore, we will not be talking about pyramids and we will not be talking about other civilizations, but we will be talking about events which I think can be historically validated and which in recent years biblical scholars have tended to prove to be actual events that have historical basis. Finally, I want to urge you not to view the Torah as a book of myths. Now, myths are very important. Myths are the ways in which ancient people attempted to describe the universe in which they lived. And because they had no science to explain the origins of the world and the origins of the universe and the origins of the gods, they created stories. And these stories, called myths, were designed to explain where everything came from and why the world is the way that it is. If you've ever studied ancient mythology, either Greek mythology or Mesopotamian mythology or Norse mythology, you know that the accounts always begin with the creation of the gods. How were the gods created? And then it proceeds from there to how the gods took the material of this universe and created the world and everything that we are familiar with. These myths, again, were not meant to be taken literally. They were meant to be stories. But I would argue that though the Bible does tell stories, its stories are not myths. We do not deal in the Bible with the story of the birth of the gods. As a matter of fact, the very first verse in the Torah begins, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." That is an axiom that we have to accept from the very beginning. In the beginning, before anything else existed, time or matter, God existed. There is no story of the creation of God. There is no proof of God's existence, as we would argue from a scientific point of view. There is nothing but the affirmation that before everything existed, there was God, and that all of reality came about because of God's will and his divine word. So the Torah, though it will be a book of stories, is not a book of myths. I have told you what the Torah is not. Now let me try and tell you what I think the Torah is. First of all, if you ask me, Rabbi, do you believe the Torah is true? I would say to you without question, yes. The Torah is true. It is not a fantasy. It is not a created account. It is not a false narrative. The Torah describes the true condition of mankind, of humanity in the world. But while I believe that the Torah is true, I want to tell you that Judaism believes that it is true, but not literally true. We Jews are not biblical fundamentalists. Biblical fundamentalism, which is practiced by some of our Christian neighbors, believes that every single word of the Torah is not literally only absolutely accurate, but literally true, is to be read exactly as it was written, that the world is exactly 5,781 years, that each of the days of creation was exactly 24 hours, that the serpent did speak to Eve and as punishment lost its legs. But Jews have never read the Torah literally. That is not the way Jews read the Torah. We read the Torah through the eyes of Jewish tradition, through interpretation. And unless you are studying Torah through the traditional means of midrash, of Jewish interpretation, you will get a very wrong attitude toward what the Torah is all about. And you will consequently be led to doubt and to become skeptical of a number of the passages that you will read. What I am arguing is, what I am urging you to do, is to read the Torah in this new way with me over the next 10 weeks. We will read it as a text designed to explain the most important questions human beings have. Where does all reality come from? Why is the world the way that it is? Why are we human beings created the way we are, with freedom and subject to suffering as well as to blessing? The Torah is nothing less than an attempt to explain a relationship between our Creator and humanity, and then to take that story and particularize it by describing the relationship of our Creator with the forefather of our people, Avraham Avinu, Abraham, and to describe the story about how God entered into a special relationship with one group of people, the people of Israel. Now, each week I will present an opening session just like this. I will not go through the material with you. I assume that you have already read chapter 1 in your text. What I would like to urge you to do is the following. Go back over chapter 1 and read it again. And read it this time asking yourself certain questions. What is the text saying? What is it about the text that seems problematic? What am I having trouble with? What doesn't make sense to me? Why is the biblical author, why is the Torah telling us what it is telling us? What deeper meaning does it seem to have? I'm going to suggest right now some questions for you to think about as you read the first chapter of the book of Genesis. You may also refer to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's book, which accompanies this course as well. You will find all of the reading assignments given on the assigned pages, on the reading pages for each of the 10 weeks of our course. I would like you to consider the following questions as you study this first chapter of Genesis. I've mentioned some of them already. I will repeat it. Is it true that the world is only 5,781 years old from the time of creation? How do we get that number? Where does the year 5781 from creation come from? How does that number even calculated? See if you can figure out how the Bible arrives at that number. When you come to study the days of creation, I want you to look at the order of creation. What did God create first? What did he create second, third, and so on, till he finishes the work of creation on the sixth day with the creation of humanity? Is there a logical order to the story of creation? Is there a basis for seeing a scientific, almost an evolutionary approach to the world in the account of the 6 stages of creation that are mentioned in chapter 1 of the book of Genesis? And I want you to also ask yourselves the question, not only if you see a certain pattern there, but why was it that each day a certain thing was created before the next thing? And finally, another question for you to consider on this first section, why did God create man last? Why was it that man, ostensibly the reason for God's creating the world, why was it that God reserved his creation till the very end? If man was the most important part of creation, if all the world exists for our benefit, why did God not create human beings first? As you read the story of human creation, I want you to pay particular attention to the fact that other animals were created with partners. But when it comes to man, the Torah says that he was alone, and then the Torah says it is not good for man to be alone. God himself states, it is not good for man to be alone. Why isn't it good for man to be a sole creature? Why does man need a companion in order to share his life with him? And why does man need other men? Why do people need each other in order to fulfill their purpose in God's world? You may consider, as you read the first chapter, you may consider the question of whether certain events actually took place or not. Whenever you have a question, write it down and prepare to discuss it in the chat room discussion. And actually, let me make another suggestion right now so that I can anticipate what your questions might be and so that we can prepare a little before next Monday evening at 7 o'clock. May I invite you, as you read the first chapter of the book of Genesis, and as you come through materials that either interest you or trouble you or bother you or intrigue you, whatever it may be, write down some of your observations, and then if you can, write to me at rabbihouse@gmail.com or directly through the website that we are broadcasting on. Okay, we are broadcasting through YouTube. This is called, by the way, The Learning House, and house is spelled H-A-U-S-S. All of the presentations will be made on this medium, on this format. Please find a way to let me know what interests you, what you want to discuss, so that when we come together on Monday night, we can have a basis for starting our discussion. The real meat of the course is not just the reading and not just these opening words of presentation. The real basis of the course is the discussion that you and I are going to have each week for about an hour at a time, discussing the chapters we have read and trying to discover what the deeper meaning of the verses and the chapters of the book of Genesis are all about. I hope that you are as excited as I am about this educational venture. As you can see, the presentation is not long. It did not take a long amount of time. And should you decide, even if you have not formally enrolled in our other courses, should you decide to check the Learning House, you are certainly more than able to view the other lectures and the other courses in the series, the book of Joshua and the Shabbat, the Sabbath day. We do have a limited amount of chat room space, so hopefully you will be with us in the correct chat room that you have signed up for. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Allow me to express the hope that as we enter the week of Hanukkah, we all of us are committed to light, to increase the light in this dark world. In a moment when we are going through some very difficult times, when our world has been shut down and when we have been confined in our homes in an even more restrictive way, may we reach out to each other through the medium of the computer screen, and may we constitute a community, a virtual learning community. Thank you to all of you. I look forward to seeing you next Monday evening.